To understand Charles Darwin, you have to understand that his life and his science were essentially the same thing. They weren't two separate tracks running side by side, they were intertwined, often so tightly that it's hard to tell where the man ends and the theory begins. This is something his son, Francis Darwin, had to grapple with when he sat down to write this biography. It wasn't a simple task. Charles had a habit of being incredibly frugal with his paper, often writing important notes on the backs of old letters or using scraps of discarded correspondence. To reconstruct the timeline of how the theory of evolution actually formed, Francis had to act like a detective, piecing together the fragments of his father's life from private, factual diaries and those recycled scraps of paper. He realized that to truly understand the man, he had to follow the science, because Darwin's personal character and his professional research were inextricably linked. The story of Charles Darwin doesn't really start with a single eureka moment in a garden. It starts much earlier, with a lineage of men who were defined by a specific kind of restless curiosity. If you look back through the Darwin family tree, you see a steady climb from 16th century Lincolnshire yeomen to a family of landed gentry, lawyers, and intellectuals. There was a sense of intellectual momentum that seemed to build through the generations, creating a foundation of scientific inquiry that was almost a family inheritance. Take his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. He was a philosopher and a poet, a man whose mind wandered through the complexities of life and biology long before the term evolution was common parlance. But the roots of this curiosity go even deeper. Then there was his great-grandfather, Robert Darwin of Elston. Robert was a man of rigour and stability, a lawyer who also had a deep practical engagement with the natural world. In 1719, Robert played a pivotal role in scientific history by bringing the first remains of a Jurassic reptile, a plesiosaur, to the attention of the Royal Society. It's a fascinating story. The fossil had actually been used to reinforce the edge of a well in Elston before it was recognised for what it was. Robert communicated with William Stukeley to get the fossil to the Royal Society, where it was described as a rarity never before seen in the island. This detail is crucial because it shows that the Darwins weren't just observers of nature, they were active participants in the unfolding story of how we understand the Earth's history. This pedigree of scientific inquiry and social standing provided the intellectual framework and the stability Charles needed to spend decades working on a theory that would eventually shake the very foundations of society. As we move into the core of the volume, we see Charles moving from this inherited curiosity toward a massive, structured framework of thought. It's helpful to think of his scientific journey not as a sudden lightning bolt, but as a slow, often agonizing construction project. For many years, Darwin had these unpolished, scattered thoughts about how life changes over time, but he was cautious. He was a man who felt the weight of his ideas long before he was ready to share them, treating his research with a level of strategic care that bordered on the obsessive. A major turning point in this process was the writing of his sketch in 1844. This was a massive, 231-page blueprint of what would eventually become On the Origin of Species. But interestingly, even at this stage, the theory was incomplete. If you look closely at that sketch, there's a glaring gap in his logic. He understood that species changed, but he hadn't yet fully grasped what he called the divergence of character. This is the essential mechanism. The idea that small, incremental variations in an organism can eventually lead to the formation of entirely new species. Without that piece of the puzzle, the whole machine didn't quite work. He had the engine, but he was still trying to figure out how the gears actually turned to move the vehicle forward. He spent years refining this specific point, knowing that without a clear explanation for the divergence of character, his theory would be vulnerable to the most basic scientific critiques. This gap is where we see the human side of Darwin emerge most clearly. He wasn't just a detached observer, he was a man gripped by profound anxiety. He knew that what he was working on was dangerous. He knew it would challenge the deeply held religious and social views of the Victorian era, and he felt the immense pressure of that potential conflict. This tension is captured perfectly in a contingency letter he wrote to his wife Emma. It's a rare, vulnerable moment in the text. In it, Darwin expressed a very practical, very human fear. He was worried that he might die before his work was fully realized. He requested that Emma set aside funds so that if he passed away, an editor could be hired to finish and publish his research. He even went so far as to suggest specific scientific heavyweights, like Charles Lyell or Joseph Hooker, to handle the task. This wasn't just about vanity, it was about the survival of a truth he felt he had uncovered. It shows a man who was obsessed with the legacy of his ideas, even as he feared the end of his own life. As the years passed and his theory matured, Darwin's method of scientific argumentation became incredibly strategic. He wasn't just throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck. He was a master of preemptive strikes. He knew exactly where his critics would attack him. Topics like the complexity of the eye or the nature of instinct were massive stumbling blocks with a theory of evolution. So, he addressed them early and often in his writing. He would bring up the most difficult questions himself, tackling them head-on before his opponents could use them to discredit him. It was a brilliant, almost defensive way of building his case, ensuring that by the time he reached his final conclusions, he had already neutralized much of the opposition. By the time we reach the end of this first volume, we see the transformation is complete. The man who started with a flawed, incomplete sketch has become the master of a cohesive, overwhelming scientific framework. The theory had moved from a collection of observations about finches and fossils to a grand, unified explanation of life itself. When we look back at this entire arc, the most significant shift isn't just what Darwin discovered, but how he changed the way we view the mechanism of existence. Before Darwin, the prevailing view was one of special creation. The idea that every species was a sudden, purposeful, divine act, designed specifically for its environment. It was a world of teleology, where everything had an inherent purpose and a divine designer behind it. Darwin's work shifted that paradigm toward a system governed by mechanical, natural laws. He replaced the sudden, divine act with a process of continuous, observable development. In his world, complexity wasn't something that appeared all at once. It was something that emerged through the slow, relentless pressure of natural processes. It was a move from a world of why to a world of how. This transition is mirrored in the very way Darwin lived his life. He was a man of immense patience and meticulous detail, someone who understood that the most profound truths are often found in the smallest, most incremental changes. His life was a testament to the idea that you don't need a single moment of revelation to change the world. Sometimes, you just need a lifetime of careful observation and the courage to follow the evidence, even when it makes you uncomfortable. In the end, Volume 1 shows us that Darwin didn't just uncover a biological fact. He provided a new lens through which humanity could view its own place in the natural world. He took the mystery of life and, rather than stripping it of its wonder, he gave it a mechanism, a way to see the interconnectedness of all living things through the lens of time and change. He turned the history of life into a story of persistence, adaptation, and an endless, unfolding struggle for existence. And in doing so, he changed the way we see ourselves forever.